Hello, I'm Terry Palmer. Thank you so much for letting me present to you today. A little background about myself. I'm a commercial pilot, and I have been doing safety programs and accident investigation and promoting simulation for my entire career. I started out owning a flight school in order to get my ratings. I suffered through all of the training that is necessary to get all of the ratings. And at that point in time, which by the way was several decades ago, I realized there's so many improvements that we could make for training. So I've dedicated my career to making training better. After I left the flight school, I went to work for a helicopter operator for several years before I ended up at Flight Safety International, where I actually taught Falcon jets. But my heart was in the helicopter world and improving training for helicopters. The one thing that I have noticed throughout my career is that checking inside the box, training to proficiency, is very important. Normally, it's check the box, we're going to train. This is what we have to train, check the box, we've trained. Let's talk about outside the box. What exactly are we looking at when we're training? Are we training just to meet the regulation, or are we training to proficiency? That's extremely important, especially in today's society. We are dealing with aircraft like we have never seen before. If we think about what aircraft looked like in the past and what our vision was for the future, we thought about the aircraft, we thought about making it extremely comfortable, we thought about making it ergonomic, but we didn't put a whole lot of effort into thinking about what the training would look like. If you think about your automobile, okay, if you look at the cars of 20 years ago, if you look at the cars from 10 years ago, what exactly did they look like? And were they easy to operate? How much training was involved for you to drive a car? Nowadays, if you look at the car that you have to drive, it's all computerized. There's all kinds of things that you need to spend several days working on to learn how to do. And this is something that we did not think about. We just want the convenience. We want the new aircraft to be everything that we could possibly do inside an aircraft. We want that aircraft to have in it any kind of convenience. But thinking about the training, that's another story. So the vision for the future, what are aircraft going to look like in the future? How are we going to train for them? Are we going to train the basics, or are we going to train to proficiency? Are we going to train and let the aircraft do as much as it can do on its own, automated, or are we going to learn to actually fly the aircraft? These are the things that we need to think about when we're training. Training is critical. Training originally started basically, let's learn the skills, let's go learn how to fly. But regulatory compliance played a major factor in this. Little by little, the regulatory agencies around the world started putting in regulations that would actually make flying safer, that would put more information as far as training on the pilot and on the instructor and on the flight school to make training safer. It also made things more efficient. As you started to train, it made it a whole lot easier if you understood exactly what you were doing in modules. Each particular maneuver, each particular subject was covered in a specific order. It made things more efficient, and it followed the regulations. The problem was that people started doing this on a regular basis in a more general form. How do I mean that? So you look at the training and you say, you know what? I am trained to fly an airplane. I am trained to fly a helicopter. Well, on the helicopter side, let's talk mostly about helicopters because that's where I've spent my last 30 years. Okay, if you look at helicopter operations, what is a normal helicopter operation? There is no normal helicopter operation. Everything is different. Every specific uh, item that helicopters can do are different. You can fly offshore, you can fly tour operations, you can be putting out fires, you can land them anywhere. Okay, so there is no such thing as a normal helicopter operation. So getting training has to be specific to the operation, the geographical location, and the type of aircraft. So when you look at these things, it's extremely important to know that you are learning everything that you need to know, not just what is in the regulatory compliance or not just what's in that efficient training manual. You are learning to proficiency. So learning to proficiency also is great for customer satisfaction. So if you're in an operation, not a flight school or a um, personal private type flying, but if you're in an operation where you have to fly specific missions, then customer satisfaction is key. And understanding that particular mission is absolutely key. So training to that is very important. New equipment. You know, one thing about aviation is if some new equipment comes out, whatever it is, it can normally be added to an existing aircraft. So when do we actually learn that new equipment? Do we do it on a regular basis? Every time we fly? Okay, if we are, then we're learning as we fly. Do we do it when we go into a training session? Whether it's a biannual training session, a 6-month training session, or a quarterly training session, when are we learning this new equipment? It's most important that we do it while we train versus I'll just catch it on in the air. So new equipment has to be trained to proficiency and technology. The new aircraft are so high tech. There is so much in there that needs to be trained to proficiency. So if you look at your new automobile and you get in there and it's got all kinds of bells and whistles and it's got computer lights and it's got a GPS and it's got all these things in it, and you've got to sit and go through each window and learn it. New aircraft are the same way. And do we learn this in a training center? Do we learn this in a simulator? Do we learn this in the aircraft? Whatever we do, training to proficiency means more than understanding a few of the windows that we actually have to look at when we're training. And all of this has to do with safety. And success is safety. So if we're not safe, we're not going to be successful. So training is critical. Pilot training. Let's look back at helicopters. So pilot training years ago in the aircraft, maneuver after maneuver, very low tech aircraft, simply flying the mechanical side of it, understanding the basic aerodynamics and learning how to fly. That was then. Nowadays, there is so much equipment in the aircraft. There are so many things that we have to learn, so many things that we have to do, that it is extremely important that we study everything more efficiently than we did before. So, and in greater depth. So if you look at the training sessions of the past, there were specific maneuvers that were done. We did those maneuvers and then we were finished. We completed the maneuvers. That's fine. Now we get in an aircraft and we have all kinds of technology that's telling us how we're doing the maneuver, what exactly the aircraft is doing, how is the aircraft feeling, what are the what's the mechanical health of the aircraft. All of these things are right in front of us and we have to understand what they are, and the best way to do that is in a simulator. So for years I have been talking about simulation, especially on the helicopter side. you know Back in the beginning, in the then window that you're looking at, they didn't have simulation. When they finally started getting simulation for aircraft, it wasn't for helicopters, it was for airplanes. helicopter simulation is something recent. Is most of it came within the last 10 years. And most helicopter operators, even 10, even 5 years ago, were not using simulators. So now it's just starting to get that way. The aircraft have increased their technology, but the training had not. And the same thing on the maintenance training. Old-fashioned maintenance training, they used to do it just by going to the aircraft and, on the job training, figuring it out as you go along. Nowadays, we have modern technology that helps train for maintenance as well. There are even maintenance simulators that train the maintenance crews on the technology. Maintenance crews originally were taught to do the basics. This is the mechanical functions that you have to do. And if you look at an airframe and power plant mechanic, an A&P mechanic, when they're trained the old-fashioned way. These are the basic things that you have to do to maintain an aircraft. They're not trained on technology. They're not trained on helicopters. They're trained in a fixed wing and environment. These are the basics. Hopefully they get a little bit of jet engine in there, and that's it. Everything else is on the job training until recently. Now the manufacturers and the OEMs are starting to put in more high-tech training centers that will do things that help the mechanic learn about the new aircraft, and they're able to maintain it much better. So just as pilot training has improved over the years, so has maintenance training, and it's still growing because we're still adding more technology. So how have we been training over the years? Whether it's to get your private pilot license or your commercial license, your ATP, whether it's to be a mechanic, how have we trained? We've trained to meet the regulations. Okay, so a private pilot can walk into a flight school and say, okay, how do I learn how to fly? And you start explaining how you're going to learn how to fly, and you have to have, by regulation, so many hours. How many pilots actually can totally train from start to finish in that 40 hours of regulated time? It's not normal, okay? An average private pilot will learn to fly and get their private pilot's license in, say, 56 hours. Okay, that's average, all right? It could be anything. It could be 80 hours. It could be 100 hours. I've seen people take a lot longer. So we train to regulation, but are we training to proficiency? So if we can get all these maneuvers done and we can get everything done in that 40 hours, are we actually proficient? Well, think about it. If you want to get a job in aviation, one of the first things they ask you is, how many hours do you have? They're not saying you have to have this many hours to be able to fly. They're saying you have to have this much experience to know how to fly our missions. And the experience means that you've trained and you understand what you're doing. So in the new high-tech aircraft, we're training to proficiency, not just to meet the regulation, not just to meet somebody's idea of how many hours you should have to fly for them, but you're doing it so that you're comfortable and safe in the aircraft. Now, how have we been training from an operator standpoint? Strictly by budget. Budgets get cut, training gets cut. Never fails. So this is something where in the last few years, the insurance companies have come forward. The regulators have not changed how much training you need to have, but the insurance companies have come forward and say, hey, if you're going to fly that aircraft and we're going to insure you, then you need to have so much training. And that's been the success factor of many training organizations, where the insurance have actually dictated that pilots have trained in simulators. So that has been a big, big part of it. Now, on some operators, you're also looking at the schedule. Well, if we send a pilot for training for 3 or 4 days or a week, what is that going to do to our schedule? Can we get somebody to fill in the meantime? And that's a big factor, and that plays into the budget as well. And then there's the turnover. Okay, so a pilot gets hired by an operator. They send them for training. They get them all qualified for training. And depending on the type of aircraft, it could be anything from 4 days to 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So they get the pilot back, and then the pilot lasts maybe 3, 4 months and decides to move on. And now we have turnover. So now they have to get another pilot, send another pilot for training. So they look at these kind of things and say, is this going to fit in the budget? The thing is that it must fit into the budget. Training is absolutely critical to safety. And I have been preaching this for several decades. Training is critical to safety, and training to proficiency makes people safer. We also have to look at instructor availability and resource availability. Now, instructors are not usually too difficult to find because there are plenty of pilots that either enjoy being instructors or are using that to build time for future employment. But resource availability had been a factor. So on the helicopter side, 10 years ago, when I started promoting helicopter simulators, there weren't very many. And I actually talked with the insurance underwriters and said, why don't you, ask for simulator training for helicopter pilots that are flying, turbine aircraft, but you do for fixed wing? And they said, because there aren't any helicopter simulators. And I said, well, there's a few. So over the years, there's been more and more resource availability, and the manufacturers are actually putting in simulators now that will meet the needs of their customers as they buy more aircraft. So that's helped tremendously. What I'd like to see, and where there's starting to be a lot more interest, is putting simulators into flight schools and getting the pilot to be able to use the simulator, learn proficiency without the stress of the aircraft, and also make them comfortable in a simulator, because now when they go for any kind of commercial use or go to work for an operator and get a job in aviation, they're already conditioned that so much training can be done in a simulator, and it makes them so much safer and so much more proficient. So the regulations are totally different depending on what type of operation you're flying, but every one of them has training requirements, whether it's Part 135 as a charter operator, Part 121 as the airlines, 133, 141 for a flight school. All of these have specific training requirements, but they should not be the only driving force in training. Now, the Part 145, that's on the maintenance side. But none of these should be the only driving force for training. The driving force for training should be training to do the mission, to focus on exactly what is being done in that operation, and being totally proficient and comfortable with what's going to happen. If you're not comfortable either flying or maintaining an aircraft, then you are not proficient. And that's the key factor in training. And that should be the driving force. Training to understand and make yourself comfortable with whatever the mission is going to be. Since budgets dictate so much of the training, it dictates how much time is spent on training. And I started watching some very interesting factors when it came to this. So for many years, operators, once they developed a training program for a specific aircraft, they would have a training program for a new hire pilot or for an experienced pilot. On a flight school level, you would have training for a person learning for private pilot, for instrument, for commercial, etc. So you dictated a certain amount of time, and it was built into the training program. What didn't get considered when all this was happening was the changes that were happening in the aircraft with technology. And learning technology is a big factor. So when I was first working with Flight Safety International, I was teaching the Falcon 10. The Falcon 10 is an aircraft that has no digital component. It's all analog, it's all steam gauges. And, you know, you can get very proficient in steam gauges. You can get very proficient in flying an aircraft with no technology. So now if you move up, and I moved up and started training in a Falcon 2000, which had all this glass cockpit, I was totally lost. I mean, where do you go? I mean, the amount of training that I would normally spend to train for a recurrent or to train for an initial totally changed because the environment changed. I had to not only learn to fly the aircraft and to understand the aircraft, I also had to understand the technology and the changes in technology, which affects your scan, which affects everything that you do, including your decision making. So the complexity of the aircraft is very, very important. So as I was training for helicopters, I recently when I left flight safety, I went to work for a company and I opened a training center. I put in simulators, we installed simulators, and we worked with pilots going into Part 135 operations, mostly air medical operations. And you could see the difference if a trainee came in that had prior glass cockpit experience, their level of training and the time it took to train them was totally different than if somebody came in and they had either strictly no turbine time or they had no glass cockpit time. It would take longer to train them. So in budgeting for training, you have to consider the complexity of the aircraft and the experience of the trainee. Um, I would hear from companies that would say, you know what, I'm going to train, my pilot is going to take 6 hours of simulator time and it's going to work. And this is what we're going to budget for. That doesn't always work. So it might take 6 hours for somebody with prior experience in the aircraft or that has glass cockpit experience or turbine experience. But when you get somebody in there that doesn't have that, it might take twice as long. And this is something that needs to be budgeted for. And it's much easier on the pilot as well in training because they're not so stressed, you know, saying, I've got to get this in 6 hours. So it's very important to budget the right schedule. Operations schedule is often a factor as well. You know, how much time do I have before I need to get that pilot on the line? How much time do I have to get this done? So the training is often tied to the schedule of the operation and tied to the schedule of the training center. And the two don't often match. So this is something that can put significant stress on both the instructor and the student. And sometimes I've actually seen students fail because there wasn't enough time to put into that. And I'd actually seen where, you know, training requirements to check the box, okay, so much training has to be done. We're going to check the box. However, the student was not actually proficient. And often I would hear, well, they'll get proficient when they get out there and they start flying. That doesn't always work. It really should be done for optimum safety. Proficiency should be done in the training cycle. Personnel turnover is so commonplace, you know, and we go through these cycles where we have a pilot shortage and then we have an abundance of pilots and a pilot shortage and abundance of pilots. Now in the current health environment that we're going through this year in 2020, there's going to be more pilots than there were available before since there's been less operation. However, we are going to still do that cycle and we're going to have a pilot shortage again. We're going to have a maintenance shortage again. This is going to constantly happen. Turnover is real important to think about when training. The training expense and the personnel shortage, with anytime there's a higher than normal turnover, can impact the quality of training. And then people are not necessarily either training to proficiency or covering the right subjects. So this is something to think about, you know, in the turnover. How are we developing our training programs and how are we going to use them? Resource availability. Resources such as simulators and hands-on training resources are now getting more available and more affordable. I am finding this to be extremely exciting. There are so many companies out there that are now looking at putting in their own simulation and building their own training centers. Um, and this is important because training centers within an organization are going to train to the mission, to the geographical area. They're going to be more specific about what's going on. Um, Training resources within an organization make it much easier to standardize training, to make it so that no matter which one of the aircraft the pilot is going to be flying for the specific company, they are comfortable in moving from aircraft to aircraft because the training is actually built around their operation. If you look at how an airline works, um, let's take, for example, Southwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines, all pilots are trained to fly all their aircraft. They can put any pilot in any one of their aircraft at any time, but they're flying strictly 737s. And so that's easy. They train in 737, in 737 simulators, and then the pilots can fly all of it. Other airlines, that have multiple types of aircraft, they will train their pilots in one, maximum of two types of aircraft, and they will keep them proficient in those aircraft, and they build that into their own training centers and their own simulators. And I'm seeing more and more operators do this on a Part 135 level. I'm also seeing a lot more flight schools starting to put in the simulation to train in a standard way with all of their private pilots, especially instrument pilots, and then training for commercial, etc., by using the simulation. And it's so exciting to see more and more of this happening and it to be an accepted resource. Training is often used also as a marketing tool, and the better the training, the more of a marketing tool it is. So I have seen operations that are going to their customers to sell their aviation services. It could be anything from air medical to tour operations to offshore to firefighting, whatever they're doing with a helicopter. They're talking to their customer, and training is always a key factor in selling their services. So they will explain to their customer how they train for new aircraft models, because a lot of times the customers dictate what aircraft that they're going to fly. They'll talk about training technology and avionics, and this is where simulation comes in. And what the customer is most concerned about is safety. So they'll talk about how they're training for safety. And that's why I like to stress that training for safety means training to proficiency. And so quite often they will tell the customers that. So it's very important that they actually do what they say. And that's where the insurance industry comes in. And they start realizing what is available for training, and they will actually dictate over and above the regulatory requirements on things that need to be done. You will also see this with any kind of accreditation agency. In the helicopter world, there are several different types of accreditation that are used on a regular basis. Air Medical has an accreditation called CAMES, Commission on Accreditation for Medical Transport Systems. The tour operators have one called TOPS, which is Tour Operator Program of Safety. There's several different ones. Every different segment of the helicopter world has some sort of accreditation, but the big one is the HAI, Helicopter Association International, has an accreditation program that they offer to supplement all of the other accreditations, but also to provide the small operator with some sort of safety management system. So this is all working into training and how training is part of this. The insurance industry, for example, as well as the accreditation organizations, will suggest that in addition to training aircraft specific and mission specific and location or geographical specific, that you also train for the decision-making possibilities, specifically inadvertent IMC. Getting into poor visibility conditions has been the cause of so many accidents that we have looked at. And in the last 2 years, on the helicopter side, there's been way too many of them. In training for entering inadvertent IMC conditions is extremely critical and should be done either with a simulator or one of those new high-tech view limiting devices that can be used in an aircraft. So those are the two ways that they should be trained, and it's something that insurance companies and the accreditation firms are actually pushing to get done, because that has been the cause of accidents, that increases safety, and it helps with pilot decision making. On the HAI, Helicopter Association International level, I'm the chairman of the training working group. And the training working group has put a lot of efforts in the last year into developing training for inadvertent IMC. And we've actually developed training which is going to be used in online training sessions, with simulation scenarios, with in-aircraft scenarios, and also training for the customer to see exactly what is involved in the pilot decision-making process in the go, no-go decision based on weather and visibility. So these are things that are very important to be included in training, to think about in training, and are often used as a marketing tool for training. The latest training modules are so important for technology, and I've mentioned this several times. You know, training for technology, where do we even start? The technology is changing so rapidly. I mean, it's just like when you buy your new cell phone. Every year or every 2 years, you're buying a new cell phone. You have to learn all kinds of new apps. You have to learn all kinds of new things all the time. Well, aircraft, it's the same thing. The technology is constantly updated. There's so many new things that are being added. And then regulatory agencies are suggesting more and more equipment or applications are added to make things safer, to make things a little bit easier for them to investigate in an accident, such as flight data monitoring, um, um, health usage monitoring systems for the aircraft. These are all technology items that are actually part of what we need to learn, but also make things a lot safer in the aircraft. But changes constantly. And I used to teach human factors training for helicopters. And when I did, I would also always mention, when are you going to learn this new technology that is just put on board your aircraft? Because most of it was always added as an aftermarket item when I was teaching. And I would say, when are you going to learn this? When are you going to learn terrain awareness equipment? Just got put on board your aircraft. Unfortunately, you're going to learn it in flight. In flight, it is a distraction. To try to train in flight, if you are a single pilot, training in flight, new equipment is a distraction, and you could make some critical safety mistakes. And we've investigated accidents that prove that. So technology, it changes constantly, but it is more reliable, and it's supposed to make the pilot's job easier if they are trained to use it. We've also seen where new technology has been put on board an aircraft. If the pilot doesn't use it, the pilot is not comfortable with it, they turn it off. That doesn't help anybody. It costs money to put it in, and if it's not being used because the pilot isn't comfortable, then that's a problem. And if the pilot's not comfortable, it's because they weren't trained to proficiency. So it's very important to look at all this. Is the technology user-friendly? Is it helpful to the pilot and mechanic? And it will be if the pilot and mechanic are trained appropriately and trained to proficiency. Safety, where do we start? Well, first of all, when it comes to training, we assess the experience level of the pilot coming in, or the mechanic. Have they worked on this aircraft before? Have they flown this aircraft before? What factors do they have in their experience level that matches the current aircraft? You know, have they flown strictly reciprocating engine and now they're in a turbine? Have they only flown steam gauges and now they're going into glass? Or do they have experience in all this? And the training time necessary and the training to proficiency comes from how much time is spent working on this specific um, aircraft and working with this specific training module based on their proficiency. It's scenario based, hands on. Pilots and mechanics need to train to proficiency hands on. And that's where simulators come in handy. Comfort level with equipment, that's part of your success. Reliability, turnover of personnel, safer operations, happy customers. Success comes from training to proficiency because the pilot is comfortable, the mechanic is comfortable, and they can operate safely under those conditions. In their type of operation, in their type of environment, no questions asked. The comfort factor comes from training. So training to proficiency, it is for safer operations. It does help with the budget. It does help with the schedule. It does help with turnover. Consider your instructor availability, your resource availability, and guess what? They're improving. So training to proficiency makes for safer operations. Safer operations save money all the way around, and they help the businesses grow. Training to proficiency for the private pilot, for the instrument pilot, for the commercial pilot, make them comfortable and make them safer all the way around. If we want to make the industry safer, we have to fix it ourselves. We can't have somebody else tell us to do it. We have to work ourselves to get it done. And training to proficiency is the key. So I would like to also remind pilots and mechanics when they do go for training, ask questions, admit what weaknesses you have, because those are the things that you need to train to. On the helicopter side, why is IFR training such an issue? Why is training in inadvertent IMC such an issue? Because most helicopter pilots don't ever have to fly in instrument conditions. Most of them are constantly in VFR. So the same on the fixed wing side. If most of your flying is VFR, then training IFR procedures, even if you're instrument rated, these are perishable skills. In order to train to proficiency, they have to be trained on a regular basis. So how do we need to train? We need to take the time to train to proficiency. We need to think about what we are doing, what type of operation, where's our geographical location, what is our mission, what is our type of aircraft, what is our experience level, and recognize what we need to do to be proficient. Proficient means safe. Safe means success. Thank you very much for listening to me today, and stay safe out there.